Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and joining our first mini meet for TMRS icons. It's amazing to see so many people in the comments already, really dedicated this morning on this first day of our half-term holiday. But thank you so much for taking the time to come and join us. We've got 3 amazing speakers lined up for us today, all to talk about assessment. So the aim of kind of these mini meets is to pick one topic and kind of delve into that in as much depth as we can within the course of an hour, and hopefully it'll have real good kind of additions to your teaching and learning as well. There seems to be lots of people still joining, so we're just going to kind of give it another 30 seconds to a minute whilst people join in. Good morning to everyone that's commenting in the chat, and please do use the chat as we go through this morning to ask any questions. We're going to do kind of the presentations first and then question and answer at the end, so that the speakers can kind of focus on what they're saying and then come back to you later. But we'll be sharing those questions as we go through and any comments. We are going live on lots of different sources, so Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. Please feel free to tweet as you go along as well using the hashtag TMRS icons. The first tweet has gone out this morning already. I can see that people are retweeting and sharing that. But please feel free to join in on that as well. And any comments or anything you'd like to say just goes into the comment section. I'm going to hand over, if that's okay. So our first speaker this morning is Alice Thomas, who's coming to talk to us about kind of the journey of assessment for her. You've been working on a Farmington. Is that correct, Alice?
Yeah.
So which is really exciting because I've been doing mine. So we'll see each other in Oxford in a few weeks. But I'm going to hand over to Alice, who's going to start this off for us. So let me just share that. Thank you so much, Alice, for your time this morning, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you. When I started to research about assessment, I came to the conclusion that my key question was, how do we know that your RE curriculum is working? So through assessment, I started to think, how can we make our RE curriculum effective, and how do we know if it is being effective? So I am currently doing a Farmington scholarship, and I have tied that in with helping support the locally agreed syllabus writing for the launch of September 2024 for Coventry and Warwickshire, as we are part of the writing team for the REC Worldviews project. And I'm also doing the Cullen St Gabriel's Leadership Programme, Stage 1. So I've been head of department for 12 years, and I am currently thinking about how we can make our curriculum more effective. And obviously, with regards to teaching and learning, assessment is part of that and is integral to making that effective. So when I started to research for my Farmington, I started to think, how do you know your RE curriculum is doing what you want it to do? So how do you know it's being effective? How do you know students are knowing more, understanding more, and can do more with that new substantive knowledge? And also I came to the conclusion, actually, is there a right way to assess religion and worldviews? From visiting primary and secondary schools, each different curriculum had a different approach to assessment. So actually, is there a right way to assess religion and worldviews, and is there a most effective way? So the Ofsted Research Review report 2021 states that high quality RE curriculums lead to subject specific and ambitious end goals. And actually, when we look at assessment, we're actually assessing 2 clear categories, the knowing kind and the scholarly and skills kind, the substantive knowledge and the ways of knowing. So actually, there is no clear picture about the nature and the function of assessment in RE. So that got me thinking about the wider picture of assessment. So actually, the National Statement for Entitlement for RE states that the new curriculum model should actually move away from just a formulaic process. So when looking at assessment, I started to think, what should actually we be assessing, and how can we make it the most effective? So actually, these are the conclusions that I came to, and the National Statement for Entitlement states that actually assessment should focus more on how students learn. Assessment should be sensitive and it should be constructive. It should actually foster motivation, and students should actually see that what they are actually learning and their substantive knowledge is actually having an impact. And actually assessment should focus on helping learners know how to improve. So the feedback we give should actually help them to move forward, and it should actually recognise all educational achievements. Looking at assessment and from the National Statement Entitlement, it's actually about knowing and remembering more. So it's actually encouraging our pupils to know and be able to do more with that knowledge. Assessment should focus on, in terms of pupils' knowledge, it should actually about understanding skills. It should extend from the simple to the more complex. So when we're assessing our students, you should actually be able to see they've actually moved from the simple to more complex understanding. They've moved from the local to the global context, and actually it's about students encountering increasing contestation and controversial knowledge and understanding. And actually progression will be achieved when the building blocks are known, recalled, and understood. So from this article that I read as part of my Farmington Scholarship, I came to the conclusion that when we're looking at assessment, you can't actually separate it from your curriculum and your teaching and learning. So actually curriculum, teaching and learning are actually inextricably linked. So when all three are actually aligned and are of the highest quality, we actually facilitate effective learning, and therefore actually this translates into all students making good progress and strong academic outcomes. So you can't actually separate assessment from your curriculum and teaching and learning. In order for assessment to be the most effective, we need to look and we need to plan opportunities, and it needs to be done at certain points within your curriculum design. So your curriculum design should actually reflect the teaching and learning and what you want students to, the end goals, and what you want students to be able to do. So your actual curriculum design, and when it comes to assessment, should actually assess the substantive and the ways of knowing. So the substantive knowledge are the key concepts and are the main focal points at the heart of your curriculum. And these are the essential ideas that help our students to make sense of their experiences. So assessment can actually be seen to be the bridge between teaching and learning as well. So when we're looking at ways of knowing, we're actually looking at the, we're actually looking at the disciplinary lenses. So when we're assessing students' disciplinary lenses, we're looking at the lenses through theology, philosophy, human social sciences, history. The use of these disciplinary lenses through our assessments can actually help build a bigger picture of whether your curriculum is actually effective. So assessing students through the disciplinary lenses can be seen to provide a framework for skills and scholarly development. By implementing and interweaving these key disciplinary lenses through your RE curriculum, it will ensure consistency of skills development. The RE Council actually states that one of the curriculum aims of RE is actually to gain and deploy the skills needed to engage seriously with religion and worldviews. And also, you can't actually assess personal knowledge. So personal knowledge is something we can't assess, but actually it's the recognition that everyone has a worldview, and it should be interweaved within our RE curriculums. So personal knowledge is the recognition that everyone has a worldview, including our students. And actually the Ofsted Research Review 2021 states that when students study RE content, they do so from their own position. And this position is their viewpoint or perspective on the world, which is influenced, for example, by their values, prior experiences, and sense of our own sense of identity. But it's not something we can assess. So it's evident that not all attitudes can or ought to be assessed in RE, but RE provides opportunities for reflection and development of the individual, but it's not necessarily always accessible. So we're aware and we always plan for opportunities within our curriculum for our students to be able to assess their own position. So after speaking with both primary and secondary teachers on assessment, I came to 3 conclusions. That actually, when we're building an assessment within our curriculum assessment, we should be assessing the key concepts, the substantive knowledge at all key stages. And actually, this will ensure consistency across the primary and secondary stage. So if we know the key concepts that are being taught within our key stage 1, 2, and 3, actually we can build and we can have a clear progressive curriculum, and we can actually build on those key concepts through our assessments. So assessing the disciplines will ensure our pupils are able to demonstrate how to know about religious and non-religious worldviews. So not only should our assessments assess key concepts and should assess substantive knowledge, but actually we should be assessing the disciplines, and our students our students able to know how to know more and do more with that knowledge. And through disciplinary substantive knowledge, pupils can be able to know, understand, and do more with that. So when looking at assessment and progression, actually our curriculum design ensures pupils revisit key concepts, increasing substantive knowledge. So when students do an assessment within our curriculum, actually we're looking at, can our pupils, is it giving students an opportunity to revisit key concepts, and are we increasing that substantive knowledge? Progression shows where pupils are, not just in relation to one lesson or scheme of learning, but actually our assessments are likely to be show students where they're aiming for in the future. And actually our assessment should be a progressive curriculum deliberately builds on pupils' substantive knowledge and skills in order connections can be made and can understand and grow. When looking at assessment for my Farmington Scholarship, I also looked at metacognition and how metacognition can actually play a role within our curriculum design and assessment and making assessments effective. So being aware as teachers of metacognitive learning actually helps us to think more carefully about our curriculum design, but also helps pupils' cognitive development. So our assessment should actually be opportunities to develop and allow pupils to develop their cognitive development. And also assessments, it's about education, not only building on substantive knowledge, but also knowledge of ourselves as learners. So our assessment should be an opportunity for students to be able to show and understand and those as learners themselves. So it should be personal. So through the activities we provide for pupils, they're crucial to the development of self-knowledge and substantive knowledge. So we're looking at metacognitive opportunities. It actually requires empirical testing. So we actually do know, in order for our assessments to be, in order for our curriculums to be effective and know our curriculums are working, we actually do know we need to have assessments embedded in our curriculums, but they do need to be effective and they need to be designed in a particular way that shows that we're assessing students' knowledge and we can assess how successful our curriculums are being implemented. So as teachers, we can create metacognitive experiences for our pupils within lessons, within schemes of learning, within assessments. And these can be anything from an open-ended tasks which require students to plan. They allow pupils to decide what resources they need to complete the task. They can be not language-based. They can be asked questions about thinking, talk about thinking, and actually metacognitive experiences can be about decision-making as well, which all show our opportunities for assessment. Also came to the conclusion that when we are assessing our students, we need to embed formative opportunities and summative opportunities. Formative assessment takes place throughout the learning process. It helps students and teachers understand where they are and how they can make progress. So when we're looking at assessments and making them effective within our curriculums, they should be formative opportunities. And these are ongoing, upgraded and focused on smaller chunks of the curriculum. And you will be able to see that your curriculum is working and it's been implemented correctly. We should plan for summative opportunities, so students should be assessed summatively in the way of end of piece of learning, or it's often terminal or a final assessment of learning. So for example, end of units, end of year exams, GCSE or A-level exams, and these summative assessments are at set points in the year. So assessment must support our teaching and curriculum rather than drive it. So that is one of the conclusions that I've come to from my research, that actually assessment must support our teaching, learning and our curriculum implementation rather than actually driving it. So for the future of assessment and for the future of the projects, for the REC Worldviews project that I'm working with, and also the locally agreed syllabus, these are conclusions that I've come to, that the future of assessment should always be purposeful and meaningful. It should match the students' learning experience within your curriculum. It should be consistent through primary to secondary, so that substantive knowledge is key. It should be at the heart of your curriculum, but also it should be able to be seen as progressive knowledge that students are able to refer to, and they should be able to deploy it within your Key Stage 3 curriculum. So what they've learned in Key Stage 1 and 2, they should be able to bring to your Key Stage 3 curriculum and be able to use it as part of their assessment and as part of their through their disciplinary lenses. They should be able to build on it, and it should be a consistent and thorough approach which is adopted by all your teachers. So I find that a consistent assessment approach is only going to be workable if all teachers adopt it within the department, so all students get that consistent approach to assessment, whether it's formative or summative, so students can actually build and you can see that curriculum is actually working. So the wider benefits of having a consistent approach to assessment actually develops teachers' awareness of how to assess pupils within religious education. So ultimately what we want to do from our assessments is we want to actually develop as teachers an awareness of how to assess our pupils and to make that effective. And through also actually ensuring assessment, it is in line with pupils' experience of the curriculum. So we must make sure our assessments reflect the curriculum design, the curriculum implementation which we have within our schools. Assessment should develop and deploy critical thinking, evaluation, analytic skills. So every time students do an assessment, it should actually develop their skills. It should be an opportunity to demonstrate those key skills that we have been implementing throughout our lessons and throughout our curriculum, which is critical thinking, evaluation, and analytic. It should be opportunities for our students to be able to demonstrate those key skills. And actually assessment should be an opportunity to allow students to interpret text hermeneutically. So that would give students an opportunity to be able to assess their substantive knowledge and express their personal worldview if we give them opportunities to interpret text hermeneutically. And these are the links that I've used for this presentation, and these are the key things that I've used actually to come to these conclusions and develop my understanding of how to make assessment the most effective within our curriculums. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. That's been fantastic. There's not any questions in the chat just yet, but if people want to add them in, that'd be fantastic. And one of the comments that we've got, which I think is really interesting and actually something I found quite a lot. So I've been going into primary schools and kind of working with those colleagues as well. And it's actually this comment is that people often find that secondary school is the first experience of RS. And we found that quite a lot in our context as well, or at least students don't explicitly know that they've had some RS teaching. How would you assess that if they don't seem to have a basis for Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2 to bring into Key Stage 3?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Oh, yeah. So Julie's just put a comment saying that she often finds that secondary school is the first experience of RS. And obviously you were saying that the idea is that when they come into Key Stage 3, you can build on the knowledge and assess that knowledge from Key Stage 1 to Key Stage 3. How would you navigate that, or what suggestions might you have for people whose students don't know that they've had RE or don't come with much knowledge in Key Stage 3?
So from my primary visit and from the working on the REC Worldviews project, it's about we are developing our new locally agreed syllabus, and actually we're planning the units from EYFS right through to Key Stage 3. So we're actually planning the units that build on that knowledge. So I think it'd be about visiting primary schools. I found visiting primary schools really effective to be able to see how they teach RE. So I observed lessons, but also I looked at books and I looked at how assessments were being done. So I think it's about actually looking at what is being taught within your primary schools and how they're assessing students within RE in your local primary schools, and seeing if there is a consistent approach, and if not, how can we embed that? Because I think when it comes to Key Stage 3, and I think we're assessing students, have they had experience of assessment in primary schools in RE, or is it something that's new and they're being introduced to? So I think it's about making sure that if we are trying to build that progressive curriculum, that we're able to do so right from primary to secondary.
Perfect, thank you. There are now questions, which is fantastic. So hopefully you can see it on the screen. Dawn has asked, have you defined what it means to progress in disciplinary knowledge?
This is what we're working on right at this moment in time, and I probably wouldn't be able to discuss it with you.
Oh. Okay, well, let's move on to a different question then. I'm sure there'll be more information at some point in the future on that one when the project's done. So Molly said, what would make a good baseline assessment when students start so that we can ascertain what they have covered at Key Stage 2?
Sorry, I didn't get that one.
Oh, what would make a good baseline assessment when students start so that we can ascertain what they've covered at Key Stage 2?
That's the other issue, is if you've got a lot of students coming from lots of different primary schools, they've got a lot of different experience of RE. So it depends on how many, I think, students are coming from different primary schools that is a baseline assessment the most effective. Because what I was doing a baseline assessment, but I didn't feel I was actually assessing students' knowledge, because they'd come with such a varied experience of RE. So I felt I was doing an assessment just for the sake of it, and just to see who'd had a better experience of RE in primary schools. So I think it would be actually, if you're going to do a baseline assessment, looking at where they have come from within the primary schools, but actually either designing something different to what they would have in the primary, or just not assessing them at all.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And then one more question for you. So, actually two. Would you create formal assessments that explicitly focus on lenses? So, for example, a question that is about the history of something or about the sociology of something.
Yes, I think that is a good approach, but it depends again on your curriculum design, whether you've driven have you approached your curriculum through that disciplinary lenses, or have you done it through substantive knowledge? So I think what we're trying to do is design a curriculum that actually embeds substantive knowledge, but is disciplinary knowledge driven.
Perfect. And then, like I said, a couple more, they're coming through really quickly now. So when you talk about, I know you said you can't talk too much about the disciplinary knowledge because that's an ongoing project. But when you're talking about assessing disciplinary knowledge, is that knowledge of how the disciplines work, or tasks that use the tools of the disciplines, or both?
It would be the tools. So from my curriculum at the moment, it is literally a tool. So my curriculum actually has a tool driven. So one of the whole units is a sociology approach, for example, and therefore I would expect students to be able to demonstrate sociological skills.
Perfect. And then the last one is, have you got any examples of this that you would be willing to share for people to have a look at?
Yes, I would, yeah.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. It's been really interesting this morning. Thank you so much, Alice. I know it's always hard to go first on one of these things, but thank you so much. I don't know if people listening at home have got any more questions, but if not, we're going to get ready to hand over to our next speaker. But thank you so much, Alice. We really appreciate your time and energy this morning. So thank you so much. Lots of people say thank you in the chat as well. So hopefully the next speaker is ready and raring to go. So Alice, I'm just going to remove you. I'm not being rude, I promise. So our next speaker this morning is Dawn, who have just joined us this morning as well. And thank you so much for coming and speaking about your work on assessment. I know that you're working as part of a big project here. I'm going to hand straight over to you to talk about assessment in RE. The idea of this morning is kind of look at it broadly and then narrow down the focus. But I'm going to hand over to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Morning, everybody. Thanks, Alice. That's really interesting. Hopefully, I'm going to help to give some people some ideas, maybe some examples, and hopefully not repeat too much of what Alice has said. So I've called this assessment the good, bad and the ugly, but I'm not going to tell you which I think is which. It's just get you thinking about how assessment in RE has changed and maybe where we're going with assessment, particularly in relation to disciplinary knowledge. So as Alice said, actually, assessment is tightly linked to what we teach, our curriculum, and how we teach. And the whole point of assessment is to find out if our students have learned what we want them to learn. And obviously, there's lots of steps in between. So that's going to kind of be my focus. And as Alice mentioned, Ofsted say that this means that the student should be able to remember more and do more, and that our curriculum is designed in that way. So assessment is so tightly focused on curriculum, and I think lots of schools have been focusing on curriculum and haven't really then thought about, well, what does assessment mean? So it's really good that we can talk about this today. So again, just repeating what Alice says about the different types of assessment, I think the problem that we've had in the past, lots of subjects and RE, is that we've combined formative with summative. We've used things to try to get students to improve their learning. We get them to kind of do improvements, whatever you want to call it. We call it like green pen. But actually, summative is more about the measurement of learning. And I think in the past, some schools, some SLTs might have got people to try and measure more than actually kind of teach and learn in the first place. It becomes overwhelming. I think for us, particularly in RE, summative needs to be really quite light touch, but rigorous, and it needs to be reliable in the judgments we make about it. But we can't be doing summative assessments all the time. I don't know about you, I see Year 7 once a week. I'd be kind of trying to measure their learning more than I'd actually be teaching if I had to do a summative assessment, for example, every half term. So just a quick kind of idea of sorts of things that people might do and get thinking about how we might more think about the curriculum as a model of progression. So you might do something similar to this in Key Stage 3, if you teach Key Stage 3, that you might do kind of some formative assessments along the way throughout the year. So if you look at Year 7, and then your summative might be an end of year exam, test, whatever you want to call it, assessment. And that assesses your Year 7 curriculum. And then you go to Year 8, you do the same, Year 9, you do the same. But if we're thinking about assessment and curriculum being a model of progression, we need to actually start thinking about how we assess across the curriculum. So if you look at this diagram, you'll notice that the summative at the end of Year 8 actually includes things from Year 7, and the summative at the end of Year 9 includes 7 and 8. Because if we're building up the curriculum, the building blocks over time, we want the students to be able to do these things and remember these things across a long period of time. And I think, as Alice was saying, this is going to be a mixture of the substantive, what can they remember of the knowledge, the facts, the content, but also in terms of disciplinary knowledge, what things are they able to do to apply in terms of the disciplines. So just have a think about your summative assessments along the way. What are they actually testing? Are they testing the expanding domain, the expanding things that you're teaching them, or are they just kind of narrowly testing? I think the narrow testing has its place within the kind of topic, but actually, as you can see here, retrieval needs to continue to take place of the things they've learned in the previous year or years, so that actually it becomes meaningful. Otherwise, Year 7 is separate from Year 8, Year 9, etc., etc. So that's some ideas about kind of planning assessment across time. But the problem we've got, of course, is, again, as Alice said, there's basically no kind of research literature really about what good assessment is in RE at all. And this is kind of emphasised in the Ofsted research review. So we're a little bit in the dark about what we can be doing. So it's down to us, which is, again, why these things are really great, that we can share ideas. So I'm just going to pick on two things that the research review does say are issues with what we currently do, issues with what we use for assessment in RE, and then I'll have a look at some possible solutions. So the first thing is using GCSE questions in Key Stage 3. I see that people do this all the time. They use a 4 mark, a 15 mark, and they get students to answer exam style questions in Key Stage 3. Now, there are lots of problems with them, as you can see there. One of my biggest problems with using GCSE type questions in Key Stage 3 is they don't actually assess the disciplinary knowledge. As yet, in the current specification, disciplinary knowledge is not emphasised really at all. We can put it into our GCSE, but it's not there. So if we're going to be assessing disciplinary knowledge, We can't be asking exam type questions in the exact same way because it won't work. And these questions can be limiting. You know, what my students need to write for a 12-mark answer in AQA, at Key Stage 3, they write significantly more. They're not under timed conditions. You know, they're writing more, they're developing more, they're using much, much more because they're not under that kind of pressure. So if you were to use a mark scheme of something that is designed for something that students should write in 15 minutes, for example, and then you put it onto something where they've had, I don't know, half an hour writing, actually that's not quite assessing what we want it to do. Ofsted aren't fans of using GCSE questions. I know that lots of people have got pressure from senior leaders to use them, but they're not great. And let's be honest, if you've had to be told how to do a 4-mark question for 5 years, that's going to be pretty boring for you. Actually, Key Stage 3 is the time where you can ask really rich questions, get them to really do extended writing, which gets them to pull on much, much more than the GCSE really will. So yeah, there's lots of problems with using GCSE questions. Equally, the research review comments on kind of using generic statements, skill statements, some of which there are examples here that you might have experienced, and it's really tempting to use these because it looks quite neat and you can kind of level things and you can give marks along the way, but a lot of them are problematic. Because in my experience, when I've read them, actually the hierarchies that they give aren't actually logical. You know, I use different words being used that actually aren't a development from one to the other. You know, being able to recall a story, the next progression isn't that you can, I don't know, tell your own story. That's not the same thing. That's a different skill. So a lot of these kind of skills hierarchies they're not logical and they don't show actually true progression, and they're generic. They don't match what you've actually taught the students. They sorts of, you know, you give lots of detail. What about? What is it that you're giving detail about? And because we know that even in exam marking at GCSE and A-level, particularly in RE subjects where there's a lot of writing, it becomes too subjective. We could sit and argue that an answer is this level or that level, and we could, you know, between us, we could probably come up with several levels. I remember doing GCSE kind of moderation like that before. And actually, between us, you know, some people argued it was top level, some middle and some bottom. And by doing that, it reduces the reliability of the inferences that we make from it. So they're problematic in using these statements, generic statements. So some possible suggestions for moving forward. Now I know Ian's going to be talking about some of these as well. So he's going to exemplify that in what he's talking about. And Alice has already briefly spoken about some. So one of the really useful ways to kind of assess quickly and easily, which I want as an RE teacher, is to use multiple choice questions. And we particularly use them online because they're all marked and instantly give a mark out of however many questions you've asked. This is an RE teacher's dream. We set a Year 7 exam 2 weeks ago. Myself and my colleague, we literally just had to sit and watch the students complete it, and they got their score. Now there are problems with multiple choice, as we know. Obviously, you know, they've got a 1 in 4 chance. We actually do put in our Key Stage 3, I don't know. And it gives them the opportunity to be honest and just say, do you know what, I don't know this answer. Whereas if you're forcing them to give an answer, then it could be a guess. But actually, multiple choice questions can be used in more kind of sophisticated ways as well. So giving marks, percentages from that is nice and easy. You know, it's comparable, it's not subjective, and you can kind of record that. So this idea of disciplinary assessment then, this all depends on whether you've put disciplinary knowledge into your curriculum. And I know that everybody hasn't, and I've not fully done this in our curriculum. We're not really clear 100% in all of our topics exactly what that might mean within that topic. So really, before you can assess disciplinary knowledge, you have to make sure it is in your curriculum. Otherwise, you're assessing things that really the students haven't learned. So actually, in terms of disciplinary assessment, what is it that you are teaching them about the disciplines that you want to assess? which is why I think Nikki's question in the chat to Alice about what is it actually that you're assessing is really important. Are we assessing that the students can use philosophical tools and skills themselves on any material, or are we getting them to show how they've learnt it in the topic that we've just done, showing their understanding so far? These are big questions, by the way, that I've been doing some work with Gillian Georgiou, and as far as we've found, no one has got any answers to these. This is all kind of ideas, suggestions. You know, I don't think anybody's got this fully embedded. So going back to the multiple choice then, using it as part of a disciplinary composite task where the students get several different types of question could be really useful. So this would be a task where you could give them an unseen source of information. So this case, one of my favourites, about a survey on the belief of the resurrection of Jesus from the Bible, and really, really fascinating data. But you could have already have done examples of that with the students. So this assessment is checking, do they understand how to deal with this data and what might be the implications of it? So you can see the sorts of questions that are being asked for this source. Again, you can give marks, you can give a percentage. That's nice and kind of clear cut. You're testing whether the students can use those skills that you've taught them. And then you could start giving some more some questions that require them to explain a bit more. And this shows their understanding, gives them obviously a bit more freedom. They can't kind of guess 1 in 4 chance. And this is testing their knowledge, because if you've just taught them the topic about the resurrection of Jesus and diverse views and interpretation, different readings of the story, they can then respond to these, and you could come up with a mark scheme. Now, of course, this is where you start thinking, well, how am I going to assess it? Could it be marks as well, and then a percentage? Because remember, as soon as you start going to criteria, you'd have to be very specific what they are. And then we could get it even more developed answers, and they can show how they understand to use the data in a much more open question. And then if you wanted to, as I said to you about culminating kind of all of their knowledge, here, for example, they might have looked at examples, beliefs in life after death from the Bhagavad Gita in an earlier topic. What you're getting is to look at how they use that text and their hermeneutical skills of looking at the Bhagavad Gita and being able to compare that with the Bible story. I don't just mean in terms of what their beliefs are, but how the text is used by Hindus and how the text might be used by Christians, which gives it a much more challenging, deeper assessment. So final thing, how do we know the curriculum is working? So in our conversations, myself and Gillian, it was suggested to us that if the curriculum is well planned and well taught and learned, you should be able to, for a cohort, come up with an expected percentage of what most students will get. Now, I'm saying most students. We have obviously students that are going to be way out of that either way. But if we average it out, if we want to check that our curriculum is being taught and learnt, then this might be an indication. Now, of course, if a student doesn't get the expected, you know your students, and this is a conversation. If they've been absent, if they've not been there, if they missed some of the key lessons, of course they're not going to get the expected. But with our Year 7 exam a couple of weeks ago, I had a quick look down. Most of them were getting about 80%. To me, that's a sign that they are learning the curriculum and it's been taught, and they're retaining the knowledge. So just a couple of sources that you might want to have a look at, just to help you with your thinking. Really good book on the left from Daisy Christodoulou about assessment, if you're interested in general. On the right-hand side is a free Seneca assessment for teachers course that you can do. It's free, and it talks to you a little bit more about the detail. And then the middle one is evidence-based education, do an actual assessment lead program. If you're really, really interested, I really recommend that. That's my lot.
Thank you so much. I've got so many ideas I want to go and take away from this now. Oh my God, let's scrap all of my assessment and start again. Which seems to be a bit of the reflection of people in here as well. There are a few questions. If that's
okay.
So, And if anyone's got any more, please feel free to add them. So Ian has asked, when building a summative assessment drawing on previous years, how do you account for students who join later?
Yeah, well, obviously, they're not going to be able to do that. And when you say reporting grades, first of all, I wouldn't recommend grades on anything. I'd recommend a push kind of percentages. Now, that's where those individual students come in. You know, if a parent is aware that that's what's happened, then they're not going to expect their child to have got the same percentage of students have been there. I think it's having these discussions and making it really clear to parents that in this assessment, we are teaching what was in year 7 and year 8. And keeping it as simple as possible. Percentages most people understand. Grades just become a nightmare. So yeah, I think we just need to be honest.
Perfect. There's one here. It's quite a long.
Okay.
So Rosie has said, I've inherited an RE department with an unfit for purpose formative assessments throughout Key Stage 3. I'm going to have to create and implement an entirely new assessment system throughout years 7, 8, and 9. Any advice on where to start? Big question, I know.
Yeah, it's a huge job. So I would actually start with multiple choice questions, really easy, marked for you, and kind of go from there. I really would, because remember, multiple choice questions are used in high level academic kind of qualifications. They're not just kind of easy peasy. They're very difficult to write good ones, but they're not, you know, just because there is a 1 in 4 chance. There's lots of research. I think Ian might be talking about that possibly.
Yeah, a little bit, I think. One more. Do you give any written feedback, or is it only percentages?
Okay, so this is not how we do it at the moment. This is kind of future things. So formative is just written. We just give a do now task sort of thing. For that year 7 test, they just had a percentage. But the great thing about the Google form is it emails them their right and wrong answers. So if they want feedback to what they got wrong, they just look in the email. I'm not wasting my time kind of work out, oh, you got that one, you got that one, you got that one. But that's summative. So I think written or verbal whole class feedback is more for formative, and this percentage is for the summative.
Perfect. Oh, there's loads of questions flooding through now as well. What would you recommend in a school where you have to use levels? Obviously, you said you don't love them, but we know that some schools
if you can write your own levels, I'm assuming that you can, then make them as specific as possible to the topic that you are teaching and make it very, very clear. So, for example, in that case that I said about belief in the resurrection, make it really clear that the student can give, 2 reasons why Christians might interpret the Bible differently. Make it really, really specific to the topic that you are dealing with rather than generics.
Okay. Laura said, do you use a text and base questions from this, like the graph example, or if you kind of just use graphs?
Yeah, no, again, you could do that. At the moment, year 7s, we're using Genesis 1 to 3. You could use another one, but you've got to be sure that their literacy doesn't get in the way. That's another problem, because we don't necessarily want to assess literacy, but also that the content of what they're reading about, they understand. It's a new text. So kind of planning that in advance, which would be the text that you use, and then which would be the text that you use to assess, and make sure that you're enabling them to be able to do it.
Perfect. And then the last question, I think, is did you do the multiple choice questions in your end of year exams in class and the rest of assessment too?
Yeah, we've got sets of Chromebooks, so we just booked them in the set of Chromebooks. They did that in the class, and the rest of the assessment, we've not done the written bit on top of that with year 7. We just don't have time. We do formative in class.
Perfect. It kind of answered my question, because we have to have every assessment stuck into books, and I'm guessing the multiple choice ones are all done on laptops and stuff for you. So how would you manage that, I suppose? But
yeah, speak to your SOT about what assessment is. It's not sticking things in books.
That's a whole different argument for a whole different day. Oh, very last question, I promise. And it says, you described the open-ended question. What would you expect students to be able to do in year 7 compared to year 9? Okay, so remember the discussion that we sort of started with Alice is we need to define what that means. You need to define what that means based on your curriculum.
So whatever you have put in your curriculum that you want students to do by the end of year 7, end of year 8, end of year 9 is what you would expect them to do. And we're all writing our own curriculums. And at the moment, there is no definitions of what makes good progress in social science, in theology, in philosophy. Some of us are trying to work on that, but that would be down to your curriculum. You can't impose somebody else's assessment onto your curriculum, because the whole point is you're assessing your curriculum.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. It's been absolutely amazing. So many people in the chat have been like, oh, we've got so much to take away from this. So thank you so much. I will leave you there. Thank you so much for your time and energy again this morning. We're going to pass over to Ian, who's going to answer a couple of the questions that have cropped up in the chat for Dawn, but I think Ian is going to try and answer those now, because Ian's going to look at how assessment has changed within his own context rather than kind of a big view on assessment. So I'm just going to hand over to Ian now. Thank you again, Dawn. Ian, let's add you in. Morning.
Hello.
Ian. Hello.
Hello.
Add your screen for you. So there you go. So you're going to talk about your own assessment journey, which I think a lot of us are kind of on at the moment. Would take a lot away from this. So I'm going to hand over to you. Just do the first things in the way. So yeah, Ian, thank you so much. And over to you.
I feel really nervous now, because I think some of the things Dawn said counteract what I'm going to say. Some agree with it. I'm not entirely sure which is right. I'm always slightly scared of Dawn. So I started as head of department in 2019. Obviously, that's the year that got impacted by COVID and lockdowns and all that. But I went in with the idea of not changing everything straight away, judging what happened. And when it came to assessment, there was one year 9 issue that kind of stood out to me. So I started to make changes. We've looked at the benefits over the last couple of years, and we're aware that we're not there yet. So any suggestions that come from this, I kind of want to open a discussion. If anyone got the answers for me, feel free to send them to me. And I've made loads of notes from Dawn and Alice, so hopefully I will have some of them. So this was a year 9 example. We set the very first year 9 example that they did for me in my school. They'd studied ethics and looked at utilitarianism, Kantian ethics, virtue ethics, and then had this as their question. And the way it was done, the level on the side of it, emerging, developing, secure, then advanced and exceptional, is the way our school report. So we had these very precise things. And students were given the topic, taught, they were given the question and given a lesson to prepare, so they knew what the criteria was going to be. They could take an A4 sheet into the assessment, so it was kind of a semi-open book for them. And then they had a separate lesson to write it. I think they had a homework between the two to finish their preparations. And we had some students who came in with kind of like pretty much a pre-prepared essay that they kind of copied up, which seemed like an absolute waste of time. We had some students who came up with great notes in lessons and preparations, and then due to a range of different issues, struggled to put that down in the assessment. I had one student who, autistic, quite high needs, very intelligent, would contribute massively to discussions in lesson, wrote an amazing plan for the assessment, and then in the assessment lesson couldn't write anything and had a complete block. And so I marked their assessment based on their planning. But at that point, I was like, why have I actually then spent a second lesson on the assessment when I could just mark the plan? It seemed counterintuitive. And we also had the issue with the content of the marking criteria. What are we looking at? If someone gets 4 of the ones from secure, but 2 of the ones from emerging, where does that fall in the thing? Is it quite secure? Is it developing? Where does that borderline fall? And I wanted to try and make it as easy as possible. So we started to ask the questions, what was our assessment managing to do? As much as we had this clear content, it didn't necessarily do everything that we covered. Some students skipped out parts of the content. It's the same that Dawn mentioned in terms of GCSE questions. It was only assessing a part of the wider topic, and it wasn't doing what we were doing. And when I looked at the marks for the cohorts, end of the first kind of, it was about November, when every Key Stage 3 group had sat their first assessments, I had kind of 3 batches of students who'd done very badly, students who'd done averagely, and students who'd done very well. Now, for those that had done very well and got to the kind of exceptional advanced grades, it was clear that they had the knowledge, they could write about it because they needed that. But there were students in the kind of developing secure section where they got to developing, but they hadn't put much in it. And I was trying to work out why that was. Did they have all of the knowledge and couldn't write about it? Or could they write really well and were using a very small sample of knowledge to write well and bring themselves up? So we looked to think about how we developed this. And as Dawn's mentioned, multiple choice questions were the answer to this. I was reading a lot about the kind of the challenges of GCSE mock exams, where if you set a set of questions, you're only assessing a small part of a bigger unit and you don't actually know what students know. So you're thinking, how do we manage that? So we introduced multiple choice questions and then long form questions. And these were scaffolded by year group to try and make sure students had the opportunity to show what they knew and to be able to write in the best way they could. So here's an example from our Is Britain religious? That first topic in year 7. It's just the question about baseline earlier. We scrapped our baseline assessment. We had one that was kind of, can you name these religions? Can you name these books? What matches what, etc. We got rid of it because of the variety of students. What we do instead is we teach a first topic about whether Britain's religious. In that, we make sure that they are encountering the biggest religions in the country as we look at the census data, and as homeworks, they're asked to kind of recap on knowledge they should have from primary. And in the assessment, we kind of pick it up. But their baseline assessment is based on how well have they done in their first assessment for us, based on what we've taught them. That's their baseline for us, not a baseline that might vary depending on which primary school they went to. So multiple choice questions, relatively simple. They've encountered the British Social Attitude Survey in lessons. They've talked through it. There'd been a graph from that. Interesting, we used one that had been seen in lessons, whereas Dawn gives them blind ones, that they were then asked questions about. I'm tempted to do a mix of both. So they're given the question about something they've seen and then asked to extrapolate from new data. But multiple choice, relatively accessible to students, but it covers all the key content. And then when they move on to the long form answer, they can refer back to it. These were some of our answers for a year 7 group, 20 students who answered it electronically. We are a one-to-one iPad school. So we've done assessments on iPad using Microsoft Forms. We've also done them on paper versions. The screenshot a minute ago was the paper version for those that don't have a child iPad. And there are variances between there, especially in the written bit. I think typed answers aren't as strong as written answers, but I'm not entirely sure why that is. That's one of my quests for the next few weeks. Auto marks it. Again, students can see how well they've done. It's not perfect for the question 13 of which king was responsible because we asked them to write it in. I have to type in every possible combination of Henry VIII. Students come up with so many. It's impossible. So I have to go back and double check them, but I'm double checking one question as opposed to 15, 16 questions. We then go on to the long form section, and here's our example. You see at the top, the second line, can Britain be described as a religious country? Instead of just giving them as a long form answer to write, we break it down into paragraphs. So why might it be a religious country? Why might it not be? And then the final part is, what is your view on it? And year 7 get it broken into individual chunks. Year 8 just get the statement because they've done so many assessments. They're reminded to think about how they assessed in year 7. And in year 9s, we actually give them a choice of statement. And the idea is giving them a chance to pick an area of the topic. I realize these are all quite similar in terms of our ethics topic, absolute and relative, Kant and Bentham, consequentialist, deontological, they all overlap. But allowing them to explore different parts of the topic that they either know more about, they're more confident writing about, they feel they can describe and explain more. And so we're seeing what students can do as opposed to limiting them in there. And the reason I asked the question to Dawn about reporting and questions about if students have missed it is we are asked to report our summative assessments to parents on a 5-grade scale, the emerging, developing, secure, advanced exception scale. We've had to think about how we do this and how we make sure it is suitable for all of our students, and both parts of the assessment are counted with what we want. So this is roughly what we do. We have to report the exceptional, advanced, secure, developing, emerging. And because our assessment is split in half, we separate the 2 bits out completely, and it throws the students. We explain it every time, still throws them. So knowledge mark, roughly 2/3 to moves you up to a higher level. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. But if you've got over 2/3 of the knowledge, you're doing well. Maybe we need to increase it. And there are a couple of topics where student marks are very high, and we probably do need to move it up to around 75% just to delve into it. With the written and the long form answer, we simplify it as much as possible. And it was interesting listening to Dawn talking about having very defined ideas. We tried to simplify it because we had a bunch of non-specialists teaching. We had myself, experienced teacher. We had a teacher in the department who's got more experience than myself and has been head of the department for 20 years before they stepped back from the role. And we had non-specialists. And so the previous marking criteria was quite difficult for them. Our current one is much simpler. They know what is included in the topic. They know what has been taught. The documents that they've got to support them with that include the key knowledge, the key facts, the key information. They know what's in the multiple choice side. And obviously, if it's multiple choice online, it self-marks for some of them. And they've got the correct answers for the ones that don't self-mark to check those off. But we mark the quality of arguments, the written side of things, on a 4-level scale. So description, have they just described Britain is religious? There are lots of Christians in the year 7 topic, for example. Is there simple explanation? Britain is religious because there's lots of Christians and lots of non-Christians. I'm putting very simple one. Is there a detailed explanation where they're starting to add more? And then the evaluation tends to come in the final paragraph or 2 of the answers. So it's not in the one that I showed for the year 7s, but the 3rd section is about whether can Britain be described as a religious country based on that? Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Here's the arguments. Which is the stronger view? They should have the arguments for both sides in there. And the assessments work together to make the final report. So if someone's got evaluation and over 2/3 of the knowledge, they move up to the top grade to get the exception. If their knowledge is weaker, they're down at advanced. It's not a massive drop. It's the second highest one. Generally, if you're writing evaluation, you've 2/3 knowledge anyway. So it's very, very rare. I think we've had 1 or 2 over the last couple of years drop to advanced there. It's more interesting in the kind of secure developing area where a student who writes poorly but has a lot of knowledge will get the same grade as someone who has less knowledge but can write about that knowledge slightly better. So we're judging them to be equal in their final grade, but it tells me where their areas of weakness are. That means I can then start to think about what happens next. I've got my assessment grade that goes out to parents. The students know where they sit generally, but I've got detail behind that that gives me more information about that individual student. Have they got gaps in their knowledge? As Dawn said, I can then look at, were they absent? Did they miss a lesson or 2? Has that lesson not been taught and communicated very well? Is that a whole class situation or not? If they've not been able to write it, where is their written work falling down? What can we do about developing that? And is that, again, an individual challenge? Is that something I need to do in more detail? And we then use that to build into the future lessons. So we use our summative assessments semi-formatively. We don't go back and do a feedback task based on that assessment again, because we've started a new topic. But we go, if students have struggled with key bits of knowledge, when it cycles back around, how do we make sure that we recover that? Those keywords come back in a little bit more. And that cyclical element builds, recaps. And it was particularly prevalent in the COVID years where we were more explicitly reteaching prior year's information because it had been taught remotely to make sure that those gaps weren't there. Or do we work on their explanations and we build some more discrete tasks in lessons that clearly go through how you move from description to explanation, how you evaluate an explanation that you've given, how you compare and contrast ideas as part of evaluation. For us, it's not worked perfectly. There are still some questions. Some of the multiple choice questions are too easy. Some of the questions probably have too narrow a focus. There's some where students are getting way too high marks. There is the scope. I think we do a couple of disciplinary questions, but there's more we can do on disciplinary nature. And I've made copious notes as Dawn was talking about how we can do that to make sure those multiple choice questions follow the disciplines that we're looking at. How do we weight the multiple choice questions in terms of between the statements and to give the overall grade? It's currently 2/3. Is that the right balance? We're not entirely sure. We want to give knowledge a clear weight within the assessment, but we know that generally as we get further forward, written work is the way that they're assessed. So how do we balance that element? How do we choose our statements? Again, the Year 9 one, quite similar, and they are quite oppositional. Some are not. Well, Year 7s are currently doing a topic on how Islamic beliefs are expressed through artwork, and so the task is slightly more open, and it's asking them to pick certain expressions of art, of beliefs in artwork, some of the common features in Islamic artwork, explain the beliefs that can be seen through that and how they link together, and then whether they think this is a good way to express beliefs to people, whether they're Muslim or not, to kind of add the evaluation in. So there's no kind of false dichotomy being created there. Their personal perspective shapes whether they think it's a good idea or not. And then the final bit is timing. We get some students who race through the multiple choice question. There's some who take longer to read the questions and to deliberate them over them. How do we balance that in terms of it? I don't know the answer to that one, but all of them can be done in a single lesson at the minute, and it does benefit. I say all of them can be done. I have one, our nurture group, SEN Heavy, where we've done the multiple choice questions in one lesson and we've done the writing in a second lesson, completely scaffolded, read out to them due to low literacy, projecting the questions on the board and reading them line by line, asking them to complete them one question at a time to make sure that we avoid assessing them on their literacy. We're assessing them on their knowledge of the topic and removing those barriers. And that is me.
Thank you so much, Ian. Yeah, I think there's lots of schools who are kind of going on an assessment journey, and the honesty that you shared was, I think, really important as some of us kind of reflect on what we do and what works and what doesn't. And there are questions flooding through. Let me start at the top. So hopefully you can see the question at the bottom of the screen, but I'll read them anyway. So it says, do you see the quality of argument to be separate to assessing personal knowledge? Are skills of evaluation and personal knowledge different?
I think it depends on what the topic's doing and what we're looking for. In terms of kind of the background, we tell the students they're being assessed on those 4 features: the description, simple explanation, etc. We will have notes that tell us what that looks like for that topic. So similar to what Dawn said about making it specific, description is these are the things that we'd expect students to describe in it. For the evaluation element, that is where the personal knowledge element tends to come in, because we're asking for the description, the explanation, we're asking them to discuss the beliefs and ideas that they've discussed, whether that's specific through a lens. So Year 8s look at different perspectives of Jesus. They will be asked to, or they encounter non-religious perspectives on Jesus. They encounter Black theology, feminist theology, liberation theology, and they're asked to explore kind of those ideas, express what they're saying, and then describe whether Jesus is still relevant today, which is an evaluation of the ideas shaped by their personal understanding and their personal knowledge. So I think it comes in together. It is something where I think it's probably not as clear as it should be, and this is why it's still a journey. We're not perfect on it yet. But I think from my perspective, I think when they're evaluating, that's where their personal knowledge is shining through, because I want them to be able to express the knowledge of what we've studied, we've chosen the content for a reason, and then decide their view on it from that point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect. And this is kind of a follow-up question. How much of your curriculum content at Key Stage 3 is a preparation for Key Stage 4 or informed by your GCSE syllabus?
That's a difficult question. We did the OCR GCSE. We don't have an option on themes. We try to avoid repetition as much as possible. So year 7s have, we tend to go 4 topics in a year. Year 7s have whether Britain is a religious country, kind of overlaps with the GCSE, but it's more to introduce them to the fact that there's a diverse range of views and it's kind of why we're talking about it. We look at the problem of evil, we look at Islamic beliefs and how they're expressed in artwork. We explore the core beliefs in detail from the artwork. We look at philosophical arguments about the self. Year 8s look at topics of life and death, dharmic traditions and varied understandings and how there's like links between them. Perspectives on Jesus. So there isn't necessarily any core teaching of what is in the GCSE. Year 9, we specifically don't teach anything linked to the GCSE. So we do a crime and punishment topic because it's not on the OCR GCSE specification as a distinct unit, whereas I know it is on the AQA as an optional one, to try and avoid that. But the idea, hopefully, is that the knowledge they gain in terms of the problem of evil, in terms of perspectives on Jesus, are strong enough that it builds into what they need to learn for Key Stage 4. So there's no direct repeating, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. There's 2 more questions. So this one from Nikki says, I know that assessing personal knowledge is deeply problematic. Could an alternative be assessing how others form their worldview, identifying influences on a key scholar rather than just do I agree with their view?
I'm rereading the question just to make sure I understand it. It's a Saturday morning, Nikki. Come on. Yes. Again, I think if I go back to the year 8 topic on perspectives of Jesus, we look at the influences on Black theology, on feminist theology, and on liberation theology. So we give students the insight into what it was that shaped the worldview of the people who were there, and their then understanding of how they interpreted biblical passages to delve into it. We could probably assess on that more discreetly. I think it depends on which discipline we want to work on. I think that's part of our next steps, is how we get the written work to be slightly more disciplinary, in terms of if we're talking about different perspectives on Jesus, there's clearly a theological way to look at that, but there's also a philosophical one of should there be a universal viewpoint on Jesus within Christianity as opposed to the variances, and why that becomes a question that I think allows it. I do try to reinforce to students that we're not just asking them their opinion, but it's their opinion on the ideas of what is being put in there, of whether that's a useful one. It probably does take away from, if you're coming from a different perspective, you might not agree with it. But I think the lessons try to get them to that point. It isn't perfect. And yeah, I don't know. Can I say I don't know? Yeah.
Yeah. And then the last question is, how do you know the children know how well they are doing if you don't offer feedback? Sorry if I heard that wrong.
So when I say we don't offer feedback, we don't give them a feedback lesson. We are fortunate enough to have 3 50-minute lessons in a week, which means that, in a fortnight, which means, and because of the quirks of timetable, there's some classes where I've taught them an assessment on one day and the next day I'm starting the next topic. And to give time to mark, if you're 2 or 3 lessons into the new topic, it seems redundant to then go back and do a formative task after the assessment, after the topic is finished. So with the multiple choice online, they get an instant feedback of most of the marks and they can see roughly how well they're doing. We then mark and transfer that into their grades, which go up on the system. On their iPads, they can see their grades on the system. we can talk them through how they get there. They know how it works out. If they know what their mark was and they know what grade they've got, they can know roughly where their quality of writing is. But we don't go into the kind of the minutiae of it with the individual students. If students want to ask, they can do. We can talk them through it. What we look to do is think, how do we then improve? So if there are big gaps, how do we teach this later on when we re-encounter similar knowledge? So, for example, in the topic in Year 8 on Jesus, there's lots of references to salvation, which links to the problem of evil from Year 7. So we can reintroduce key terms that they've misunderstood and re-encounter them. Because the written element is focused on the quality of the writing as opposed to whether they've written certain sentences, we look at making sure that they can be really explicit of, if I give this bit of information as a piece of description, how can I explain that? What does that look like in this context? And we build that into the teaching of the topic, the next topic, to make sure that they're doing that in a suitable way for that topic. We don't necessarily look backwards. Hopefully, based on the way that we encounter that and we visit it, the students are able to pick that up from the teacher in lessons. But having done lessons before where you go, hey, we're starting on new topic, blah, blah, blah. Now we're going to go back and do one task on our previous topic before we carry on with our new topic, and we're not going to touch that again until it cycles back through in 3 years' time. I didn't want to lose the lesson time.
That makes sense. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you again for your time and efforts, and for sharing your assessment journey. I know that lots of schools, like I've said today, are on their own journey with assessment as well, and making changes. So everything that we've heard today from all of our speakers has been really useful, and thank you so much for giving up your time on a Saturday morning, the first Saturday morning of the half term as well, where we should all be kind of lounging around somewhere. And thank you to everyone that has been and joined today as well. We are going to leave it here. Just a couple of really quick things before we can go off and enjoy the sunshine this morning. Is the first thing is we're hoping to run more of these mini meets. So rather than kind of doing one big program, is do lots of little sessions as we go through the next few weeks leading up to the summer holidays. If anyone has got any ideas of topics they'd like us to talk about, or if they'd like to volunteer to speak, that'd be fantastic. I'll put my email address somewhere that you can find it, and please just feel free to drop me a message or message me on Twitter or whatever you'd like to do. You can find us through the TMRS icons, so feel free to just let us know. And the other thing that I've been asked to share is that there is a face-to-face Teachmeet for geography on the 8th of July in Manchester. So if you know any geographers who might be interested in going, the tickets are available, and that again you can find on Twitter as well. Thank you so much everyone for all your time this morning, for your questions, for your engagement. Thank you so much to the speakers on behalf of myself and the team. We've really appreciated it, and thank you so much. Thank you everybody.